I'd like to introduce our next session, which is setting requirements for PKI integration for business applications. Our speaker is Aaron Johnson. Aaron works for the Alaska USA Federal Credit Union on the Certificate Services Product Team as a senior infrastructure analyst. In this role, Aaron designs, develops, and implements public key cryptography-based solutions to support our credit union members and staff. Aaron started a small consulting company in Anchorage, Alaska, which specializes in implementing hybrid cards that will securely authenticate people to physical access control systems and logical networks via the same card. Aaron has designed and implemented PKI for power plants, internet service providers, healthcare providers, Alaskan Native corporations, and other businesses as a consultant for a number of years prior to his current role with the credit union. Please welcome Aaron.
My name is Aaron Johnson. Today we're going to be talking about setting requirements for privileged PKI integration for your line of business applications, appliances, and other resources. A little bit about me. I'm the Senior Infrastructure Analyst on the Alaskausa Federal Credit Union's Certificate Services Product Team. And previously, I was a consultant that built public key infrastructures for power plants, internet service providers, Alaskan Native corporations, healthcare providers, etc. And in that role as a consultant, I set up a specialty in a small consulting firm that I started, where I created hybrid cards for businesses that stored physical access control system credentials and logical, so PIV or smart card logon certificates, all on the same card. I also like to keep things creative by inventing. My latest invention is an NFC-powered treasure hunt game that's patent pending, and you can look for that soon. So privileged PKI integration, what does that mean? Well, it means you're not just consuming end entity or leaf certificates, right? You're taking a privileged role, so you're getting plugged into the PKI in some respect. So for that, it's very useful to use the old adage, a pound of, I'm going to screw up the adage, but basically, if you front load this, you're going to save a lot of problems down the road. And what do I mean by that? Well, once you've got privileged access and you're requesting or issue out certs that aren't very beneficial to the public key infrastructure as a whole, it drops the integrity of the system. It's very hard to mitigate. So in this sense, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Nailed it. So with this presentation, we're going to talk about what this could look like. Now, this was my approach. You might use a different one, but this has worked for me in the past. So the process I use is largely outlined here on the presentation outline, and each slide will represent each step of the journey. So the first step, analyze the PKI. Look at the trends, right? Find out some overarching tendencies that folks are going to be performing or behaving to in the public key infrastructure. Are they asking certs of a specific variety? Are they abusing some of their privilege roles? Now's the time to gather those things, because this document, this whole process of setting these benchmarks is going to help address that. In a sense, you're creating policy. Okay, so part of that policy creation, you have to get out there and talk to your stakeholders. Do your information gathering, right? Because this is going to be a very important document. Public key infrastructure, in its essence, is a mix of people, processes, and technology. So you got to talk to your people. Everybody uses this PKI, so make sure it reflects the workflows and the trends. So we'll talk about reaching out to stakeholders and doing that info gathering. Then an actual requirement document draft. Okay, so what kind of certificates are you going to represent? What kind of roles are you going to represent? How are you going to organize the thing? So all that's going to be addressed in this part. When you've got the requirement, we'll talk about presenting it, then the revision process, and finally, when you're done with this, you should have a pretty good set of policy to go out there and publish. Make it available to all your folks. So the first step here, the analysis, get into your public key infrastructure and read that database, okay? What are the SAF trends? What's the most frequent type of certificate that's being utilized? And what's requesting it? Is it just end entities? That's fine. You can still address that with this type of a document or this process. Are best practices being ignored? If they are, this is the process that you can go ahead and help write them. Because at the end of the day, if you don't have some kind of policy to back you, it's you against the world, right? You're sitting up there trying to enforce your will, and that's not appropriate. That's what this is for. Get your documents, get your policies, get the agreements out there, get all these best practices in writing so you can use that when you're going to try and keep the integrity of the public key infrastructure. And an example of that here, we got a little screenshot. So this is from a lab, but what you see here is one requester, right? One laptop requesting something looks like a user certificate. We're doing client authentication. The reason I say that is the common name, it would be, test iPad serial number, okay? So is this happening with the supply and the request, right? Is somebody supplying these values in the request? And if they are, is there a certificate manager doing the approval, et cetera, et cetera? So all these trends, you can go ahead and do your analysis, gather them up, and then start addressing them with these benchmarks, these requirements that you're writing. And then, of course, look at the templates. If you're using Active Directory certificate services, are these templates fairly loose? Do you have certificate managers, and are they limited to specific templates, or are they overarching, right? Do your best practice analysis. Meet what's in the wild with what you'd like to, your group would like to see happen with these requirements. Okay? So each template should have a certificate manager that's responsible for it. And yeah, reach out to stakeholders. Okay, so when you're reaching out there, you're bringing all that analysis with you. You found out some of the trends that are happening. So talk to your stakeholders about them. What's their pain points? Why is it so challenging for them the stakeholders to utilize the PKI in a way that's, lines with a little better best practices? Are there roadblocks you can help clear? This document of writing requirements can be beneficial for folks' lives. You actually can make things a lot easier by doing this analysis, reaching out to your stakeholders. You also get armed with a lot of information that you can set up on a roadmap for your group, for your entity, or your organization. Are there key technologies missing? Okay, well, front load your roadmap with these analysis. Before you go ahead and do this process, if there isn't a roadmap for your certificate services product, get one in place, right? Because what's going to happen at the end of this is they'll come back at you with a lot of good questions. And these questions are essential, but you need to have some answers. So if you have some answers ready, saying that we're working on that, here's our roadmap, here's our budget plans, our numbers, it's going to make it a lot easier. So while you're doing this reaching out, you're doing this analysis, you can also, in parallel, work on your budget plan and your roadmap. Because at the end of the day, public key infrastructure, that mix of people, processes, and technologies, it's a living entity in a sense. It's not going to be a set it and forget it. It's going to grow with your group. It's going to get consumed in a matter. Adoption rate is going to reflect how easy people can use it, how robust it is, the integrity, the level of trust. All this is something that you constantly need to improve and enforce. Okay, so when you're getting your requirement draft, one thing to remember about this, not everyone's an expert, right? Not everyone lives, breathes, and eats public key infrastructure. If you're like me, that I love this stuff. So all I read about, all I research, it's the things I get excited about. But I know that that's not the case for everyone. So get out there and find out whom your audience is, right? Because when you're writing this draft, organization is key. Are you going to come at it with the perspective of a public key infrastructure administrator. Well, that's fine. But if your audience is consuming this in their applications or project managers, there might be a team unit, a lead, they are going to need some kind of a logical workflow for this document. So for this example here that we have on the slide, this is organized by certificate use case. We've got server authentication certificates, client authentication certificates. This is the way I chose to organize it for this presentation. However, I probably wouldn't do this in real life because, again, not everyone knows what their certificate requirements are. So let's just start at some of these best practices we can enforce. We'll get a little technical here. With your server authentication certificates, okay, are you finding a lot of people asking for certificates with IP addressing in the SAN field? Okay. If they are, go ahead and document the requirement that they cannot do that. Right? That's just going to add a lot of headache down the road. Are they requesting certificates for domains you don't manage? Well, that's a no. That's a tough one, right? Of course, this is going to be in play for things like TLS decryption, but we'll talk about that down the road here. If you're using an Active Directory integrated public key infrastructure, then yeah, very tough to basically validate that. And we'll talk about how we can get around that hump for things like TLS decryption. And client auth certificates, this one happens a lot, right? Because you might have that Citrix or that Jamf or that Intune. You want to use your WLAN security, that's enterprise, where certificates are being exchanged to allow access onto the wireless local area network. So when you're doing that, think about this idea of implicit versus explicit name mappings. Okay, I don't prefer implicit anymore. Explicit for me is the way to go, and the reason is, by directly setting attributes in Active Directory, you've got that role-based access control already baked in. Okay? If implicit is in use and the key is not in hardware storage, the private key, well, that's a challenge, because if you have a UPN that's valid and it's in the SAN field, you can use implicit certificate name mapping as long as that certificate authority is in the right trust container in Active Directory. Explicit takes all of that out of the equation here, and it just links a certificate issuer, perhaps a subject, to your account in Active Directory. That overt link that's happening. A little more admin overhead, but just infinitely more secure. That's my opinion. And for client authentication certificates, are folks doing registration authority? Are they doing a certificate request agent, or are they just supplying the values in the request? And if they are they using a certificate manager to approve those requests? Well, they really should be, right? Because you don't want folks, again, to get into this implicit certificate name mapping, get in with a different account than what is scoped, what should be scoped. Are your machines all domain bound? If not, can they read the templates from Active Directory? Can you supply them in a way that templates can be your port of entry into your PKI, so that all the different settings, all the different attributes you want to be read and validated are going to be present in that issuance request? Is your registration authority Active Directory even? And then finally, for this slide, let's talk about HSM. Okay. Now, if you don't have one at your organization, that's where this comes in. By writing requirements that hardware storage is a key component for your public key infrastructure, you're starting to get folks down that road of actually using one. And like I said, if you're writing requirements that requires HSM for some privileged access role in the PKI, make sure that your road mapping process is in place to acquire an HSM. The budget is in place, the numbers are there. You're accelerating that purchase so that you can go ahead and require that, because that's going to help keep your integrity of that public key infrastructure. And I did miss one step here. So if with client authentication certificates, are folks asking for network device enrollment service? That's an acronym there. If they are, is there an option to use P12? Right, there's a lot of great use cases for P12 these days, with dynamic passwords, passphrases, encrypting the private key, transport mechanisms, really keeping things as secure and the infrastructure requirement low. Okay. And then some privileged access rules here. If folks want to become a registration authority, and there certainly is a lot of reason to do that with line of business apps like Citrix, etc., then they got to be prepared to serve that role. Are they going to validate folks' identities, right? That's key. So that has to be a part of the requirements document. If you want a certificate request agent, you got to actually do the role, be a registration authority, validate identities, etc. Now, we talked about subordinate certificate authority. This happens a lot. We've got a lot of reason to utilize something like this for perimeter security, right? You're coming in for there's a lot of different websites these days that are encrypted. Well, you got to inspect some of that traffic. So a lot of times folks will leverage a sub-CA from a trusted public key infrastructure, a subordinate certificate authority, to do what is essentially a man-in-the-middle attack. Well, we're not going to use that word attack, but yeah, you're encrypting and decrypting before it reaches your client there, so you can inspect that traffic. Now, here's the question. Do you have to issue it out from an Active Directory certificate service integrated root or issuing CA? Do you have to issue out that sub-CA certificate? Okay. Now's the time to wean that process out of the environment. Get a different PKI ARM or ARC in place for this, where all the inherent trusts that exist in Active Directory do not exist for this sub-CA certificate you're going to use on an appliance. And once that's done, inspect those templates. Can you lock them in? Okay. And if you are going to be able to do all that, document that requirement. Make people meet that benchmark. This is going to help the organization as a whole keep the integrity of that PKI. And then again, hardware storage where possible. Okay, sometimes it's tough. You have a whole lot of users that you have to issue certificates on the fly for. So if it's not possible, can it be? And is there plans to maybe move to a solution that would make that possible? Okay. If there is, then go ahead and write that requirement. But again, transparent with this. Make sure these requirements, again, we're in the draft phase, are going to be clearly communicated. And then some of the signature certificates, you've got code signing and SMIME. Again, hardware storage. But think about this whole mobile workforce question. If you're going to require certificates to be in hardware, can they get access from a mobile workforce? Can they get through to your HSM? Centralize that key storage. That's a great idea. You can document that requirement, but make sure that you provide the workflow to do that. And this can happen through something like an HSM proxy application or a solution. So if that's not in place, again, front load that roadmap, front load that budget cycle, make that happen at the same time you're writing this requirement, your team's writing this requirement. And once you've got your requirements, once your team's got your requirements down, and you're presenting them, find your decision makers. Are you using architects? Are you using engineers? Somebody that's going to then digest these requirements that you and your team are presenting and process them through the lens of your organization. Does this meet what you're trying to do as a whole? And that's where this roadmap comes in. So you've front-loaded some of these things before you even gone to this phase of writing requirements. And the reason you're front-loading it is you can't just require something that's just not possible, right? So the roadmap, by pointing out which month, which year these different benchmarks are going to be in place, are going to empower this whole activity of setting the requirements. Get some budget numbers because folks are going to have some really good questions. All of your coworkers are incredibly capable, incredibly intelligent. So you can anticipate some of those questions and get ahead of that. And that's where this whole process where you're doing your analysis, you're talking to stakeholders, you can get these trends and anticipate these questions and have your answers ready. But Don't answer out of turn. If you're not completely certain about this, just table those answers and say you'll get back to them, because again, the goal is to be transparent, to get all these requirements out in the open so that folks will meet them. And the actual goal of this is you want the consumption of the public key infrastructure to be sky high. You want folks to use these certificates. You want this technology to be able to empower them and help their business unit, their group, et cetera, to meet their needs, because PKI gets vested in everything, right? Certificates are everywhere. So the goal is to boost these business requirements and get the buy-in high, maintain the integrity of the PKI. So with that goal, sometimes you got to eat a little humble pie. Just remember to be wrong. You might have missed something on your analysis. You might have missed something in your presentation. That's okay. That's great. That's natural and part of this process. This road is not going to be smooth. It's always fraught with some road bumps, but at the end of it, it's worth it. That integrity of the public key infrastructure can empower so many different wonderful things in your business, including security and integrity. So once you've got that, now the revision happens. So make sure that you're revising with a group, right? Because you might be really great at one thing and maybe poor at another, or your coworkers might not be right on board. Just make sure you have some people to back you, and find that sponsor who's going to help you from the C-suite to even keep people on the agenda. If there's certain action items they have to do, make sure somebody's there to root for that completion, because this can stretch out for a very long process. But if you get your sponsor lined up ahead of time, you can use that carrot and stick approach a little more effectively. And then the approval pipeline. Who's even going to approve this document? How do you know when it's ready for consumption? What's the adoption process? Get all that identified during this revision process. And are there more people that may have been left out of this journey that you need to invite in? Get that done. And most importantly, complete this thing. Okay? Nobody likes half-finished work. And when you're talking about writing policy in some form, like such as these requirements, setting these requirements, it's slow, it's long, it's laborious, but again, remember the goal: boosting the integrity of that public key infrastructure. So get it done and get it out there. And as far as out there, where's that going to be? Okay, well, you can go ahead and locate this in a couple of places. Okay, you can add this to an issuance policy. And maybe your issuance policy is such as with DigiCert here, they have a whole repository that they just point folks to, and it's got a collection of all their certificate policy statements, et cetera, et cetera. Are you going to use that? That's a great idea, right? It shows that little technical tweak and helps people to find other important certificate services documents. But also, are you going to publish this in a website, or maybe your company uses SharePoint? Because when somebody comes up to your team with a request to do an integration with a privilege level, just saying, well, check the certificate, well, there's a little bit problematic because you haven't even issued any out yet. So front load this stuff and get this whole process identified so that you can publish this in a place that's going to be easily consumed. So that's the journey. That's the process that I've used in the past. Analyze, right? Find trends, revise, work with your stakeholders, document, most of all, complete. And overall, if I could add any advice, remember that goal. That's going to help you to get through some of these road bumps. Keeping the integrity of your public key infrastructure, using that ounce of prevention, that's going to be worth a pound of cure down the road. So you don't have a 60-to-1 certificate ratio or 70-to-1 for a user or devices that you have to remediate. Okay, so with that, just wanted to wrap up by saying thank you for your time. Thanks for coming to my talk. And if you have questions, you can email me. It's right there on the screen. I can help to answer some of the points that my career has helped me to realize with moving into a policy type arena with public key infrastructure. So with that, I bid you farewell and thank you very much for attending the conference.